On a seemingly ordinary night in Riyadh, the capital city of Saudi Arabia, a dark storm was brewing within the quiet walls of a well-kept home. Farid, a successful businessman, was miles away on a business trip, leaving his wife, Safia, alone to tend to their 2 children and manage the household. On the surface, it was the picture of a respectable family, a devoted wife, an industrious husband, and the promise of stability and tradition. But beneath this outward image lay a restless heart, quietly aching for something more. Safia had married Farid when she was just 20 years old. The match had been arranged, an agreement between families based on compatibility in status, with little thought given to love. Over the years, Safia settled into her role, devoted wife, doting mother, a woman of unwavering faith. She adhered to the duties expected of her, but as Farid's business ventures grew, so did his absence. He was often away for weeks, even months, traveling to neighboring countries, absorbed in his work. His successes reflected well on the family, but with each passing day, he drifted further from his wife, both physically and emotionally. Safia kept the house immaculate, cared for the children with patience, and upheld the values she was raised to honor. But no matter how hard she tried to remain fulfilled, a void grew within her, one that wealth and social status couldn't fill. She yearned for companionship, for someone to notice her beyond the duties she performed. Loneliness gnawed at her, and each night felt heavier as she sat waiting for Farid's return, only to be met by empty silence. In the shadows of this solitude, there was one person who had noticed her quiet suffering, Adil, Farid's father. At 62, Adil commanded respect in the family and community alike. He was sharp, articulate, and carried a presence that made people listen. Unlike his son, Adil seemed to have a natural sensitivity to the unspoken needs of those around him. He had observed the growing distance between Farid and Safia, the way her smile faded, and how her gaze seemed lost in thought, even during family gatherings. Adil began to offer gentle words of encouragement, subtle gestures that reassured her without crossing any visible lines. In his eyes, Safia saw an understanding, a quiet acknowledgement of her sacrifices and a respect that she hadn't felt in years. Initially, their exchanges were brief, casual, nothing out of the ordinary for a father-in-law and daughter-in-law. But with each interaction, Safia found herself looking forward to Adil's company, and he too seemed to linger a bit longer in her presence. It was in these small moments, these glances that lasted a second too long, that a bond began to form. A connection that started in shadows, slipping past the watchful eyes of family members, cloaked in the guise of familial concern. For Safia, this connection was something she had longed for, a reminder that she was more than just a dutiful wife and mother. Adil's kindness brought warmth to the cold void left by Farid's absence, and while she knew it was wrong, Safia felt a pull she couldn't quite ignore. She was standing at the edge, and with each passing day, the temptation to step over that line grew stronger. As weeks passed, the bond between Safia and Adil grew in ways neither had anticipated. What had started as casual conversation began to feel like something more, a shared solace, an unspoken comfort. In the spaces between their words, they found a warmth that was both comforting and dangerous, a connection that felt forbidden yet strangely inevitable. It was during a quiet family gathering that things began to shift. Farid, as usual, was away on business, leaving Adil to assume the role of family patriarch. He moved through the gathering with his usual grace, but his eyes seemed to drift toward Safia more often, lingering with a quiet intensity. Safia noticed it, a small flicker that made her pulse quicken. She told herself it was nothing, that she was imagining things. Yet, there was a thrill to it, a sensation that spread warmth through the cold recesses of her heart. Their conversations grew deeper. Instead of polite exchanges, they shared thoughts, stories, and reflections that resonated beyond the bounds of typical family interactions. Adil would compliment her, a gentle remark about her resilience, her dedication to family. Safia, feeling seen and appreciated, would respond with a light smile, her eyes brightening in a way that neither had seen in years. She began to sense that Adil noticed the small details, the way she wore her hair, the softness of her voice when she spoke to the children, the quiet strength she carried despite her husband's frequent absence. As the weeks stretched into months, their encounters became more frequent and increasingly private. Adil found reasons to linger near her during gatherings, their exchanges becoming charged with an unspoken tension. His hand would brush hers accidentally, and though neither would acknowledge it, the lingering contact would send an electric jolt through both of them. Safia felt herself drawn to his presence, craving his attention in a way she knew was dangerous but couldn't resist. During a family dinner one evening, Safia and Adil found themselves alone in the kitchen. She was washing dishes, and he stood beside her, drying them. The silence between them was thick, each painfully aware of the other's closeness. Adil broke the quiet with a simple question, asking if she was happy. It was a question that echoed in the quiet kitchen, cutting through the normality of the moment. Safia hesitated, her fingers frozen on a plate as she tried to gather her thoughts. Adil's gaze was steady, and in that moment, she felt as though he could see right through her, as if he understood her unspoken loneliness. She managed a nod, a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, and Adil simply nodded in return, the weight of understanding settling between them. Days later, when the family gathered at the home of Farid's sister, Alia, Safia noticed something unsettling, Alia's watchful gaze. Alia had always been perceptive, and now, her eyes followed Safia and Adil with a hint of suspicion. Safia's pulse quickened. She knew the risk they were taking, the potential for scandal that could ruin them all. Yet the pull toward Adil remained strong, growing with each stolen glance, each lingering touch. She felt trapped, torn between duty and desire, but her heart betrayed her, longing for the comfort Adil's presence provided. One evening, as Farid traveled once more for business, Adil visited Safia under the pretense of checking on the children. She opened the door, her heart pounding in her chest, unable to deny the anticipation she felt at his arrival. They shared tea, sitting in quiet corners of the home, their voices hushed yet their words resonant. In the dim light, Adil's presence felt safe, familiar, a balm to the loneliness that had plagued her for years. Their hands brushed as he passed her a cup, and this time, the touch lingered, neither of them pulling away. It was then that Safia knew. This was not mere loneliness, it was an attachment, a need that transcended the boundaries of family and obligation. Her heart thudded with the weight of realization, of forbidden desire and the fear of where it might lead. She had crossed a line, even if only in her mind, and there was no going back. As the months drifted by, the tension between Safia and Adil escalated in ways that neither could control nor explain. The warmth they found in each other's company had ignited into something more, a flame that flickered dangerously close to consuming them both. Though they had yet to act on their desires physically, the unspoken connection had taken root, growing stronger with each shared glance and whispered word. In her mind, Safia tried to rationalize it all. She was a devoted mother, a committed wife, yet she couldn't silence the small voice inside her that ached for something beyond duty and sacrifice. Every time she told herself that this was wrong, her thoughts returned to Adil. He was her husband's father, the respected elder of the family, but in those stolen moments, he felt like a kindred spirit, someone who truly understood her loneliness. Their encounters became increasingly private, hidden away from the watchful eyes of the family. Adil found excuses to visit her during Farid's long business trips, showing up with small gifts for the children or bringing supplies under the guise of helping her manage the household. But these visits were not solely for the children or the house, they were for her. And each time she opened the door to see him standing there, her heart would betray her, quickening with anticipation. In her attempt to keep up appearances, Safia tried to act normally around Farid whenever he returned. But even he could sense the shift. She had grown distant, her attention divided, her laughter forced. Their conversations became brief, lacking warmth, and Farid, though often preoccupied, couldn't help but feel the subtle disconnect. He chalked it up to the stress of her managing the home on her own and tried to push away the nagging feeling that something was amiss. The tension in Safia's life reached a new level one evening when the family gathered to celebrate the birthday of one of Farid's cousins. The room was filled with relatives, laughter, and conversations, yet Safia's attention was drawn to Adil across the room. She felt his gaze find hers, lingering with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. She quickly looked away, but the brief glance did not go unnoticed. Alia, Farid's younger sister, caught the exchange and her brow furrowed with concern. Alia had always been perceptive, and though she said nothing, her suspicion was evident. The next time Alia was alone with Farid, she couldn't keep her observations to herself. She hinted to him that something felt off between Safia and Adil, mentioning that she'd seen a look pass between them that didn't feel quite right. Farid dismissed her concerns, refusing to believe that there could be anything untoward between his wife and father. But as the days passed, Alia's words lingered in his mind, planting seeds of doubt that he couldn't shake. Unaware of her husband's suspicions, Safia continued her delicate dance with Adil. Their connection grew bolder, taking place in quiet corners of the home or during stolen moments in the garden, under the guise of casual conversation. Each encounter felt like a tightrope walk, exhilarating yet fraught with risk. She knew the boundaries she was crossing, the dangers of being discovered, yet she couldn't bring herself to pull away. The emotional attachment to Adil had become a lifeline, and the thought of severing it left her feeling hollow. Then, one night while Farid was out of town, Adil appeared at her doorstep. The children were asleep, the house was cloaked in silence, and Safia, though nervous, couldn't turn him away. They sat together in the dim light, their words soft and their proximity charged with tension. Adil reached for her hand, his touch gentle yet possessive, and for the first time, she didn't pull away. It was a silent confession, an acknowledgement that they were both standing on the edge of something dangerous, yet neither wanted to stop. But just as quickly as the moment had arrived, it vanished, punctuated by the sudden awareness of footsteps outside the door. They broke apart, startled, hearts racing as they listened for any sign of someone approaching. After a tense silence, the footsteps faded, but the brush with exposure left them shaken. It was a reminder of how fragile their secret was, of how close they were to losing everything. Safia's mind spun, torn between the intensity of her feelings and the fear that their forbidden connection would soon spiral beyond their control. The weight of secrecy was becoming unbearable, and both Safia and Adil felt the strain. What had once felt thrilling now filled Safia with an almost constant dread. She had begun living a double life, dutiful wife and mother by day, a woman swept away by dangerous affection by night. Each whispered exchange with Adil felt like a step further down a path from which there was no return. Despite her best attempts to keep up appearances, Safia was beginning to slip. Farid, though often consumed by work, could no longer ignore the changes in his wife. She had grown distant, her responses short, her attention elsewhere. At family gatherings, she seemed distracted, her laughter forced. Her warmth had faded, replaced by a restlessness he couldn't explain. He tried to brush it off, telling himself that managing the household alone had taken its toll on her. Yet a lingering doubt gnawed at him, an instinct that told him there was more to her distance than mere exhaustion. The subtle changes in Safia's behavior did not go unnoticed by Alia either. Alia was observant by nature, and the sight of her sister-in-law exchanging glances with Adil had set off alarms she couldn't ignore. She had brought her concerns to Farid in passing, though he had dismissed them at first. But the seed of suspicion had been planted, and Alia's words lingered, tugging at the edges of his mind, each passing day adding weight to his uncertainty. In late 2011, whispers began circulating among the extended family. Alia, having observed the increasing tension between Safia and Adil, confided in a close cousin. Soon, the subtle shift in Safia's demeanor, the quiet exchanges with Adil, became the subject of discreet conversation among the relatives. People began noticing the way Adil's gaze would linger on Safia during gatherings, the almost imperceptible ways she would respond, leaning closer or meeting his eyes a second too long. Safia, though careful, could feel the weight of these eyes on her, the prickle of judgment she could not escape. Farid's own suspicions deepened as he noticed how withdrawn Safia had become. She rarely met his eyes, conversations between them grew sparse, and she had stopped sharing the small details of her day. She no longer waited up eagerly for him to return home from his business trips, her interactions with him seeming cold and distant. Still, he tried to rationalize it all, holding on to the belief that his prolonged absences were the cause of their distance. But Farid's patience began to wear thin as the signs mounted. He noticed Safia leaving the house more often, her reasons vague, her responses evasive. She seemed guarded with her phone, her conversations quiet, ending abruptly if he entered the room. Farid, torn between the love he had for his wife and the gnawing sense of betrayal that haunted him, decided to watch her more closely. In the recesses of his heart, he still hoped he was wrong, that the change in Safia was a passing phase. Yet each observation only added to his growing unease. He started to catch her staring out of the window, lost in thought, her mind seemingly miles away from the life they shared. She seemed like a ghost in their home, present in body but distant in spirit, as if her thoughts were caught somewhere else entirely. It wasn't long before Alia approached Farid once more. This time, she spoke with a quiet intensity, recounting a recent family dinner where she had overheard a hushed conversation between Adil and Safia. She mentioned the way Adil's tone softened as he spoke to her, how Safia responded with an unfamiliar tenderness, the kind of softness she had never shown her brother. Alia's concern, once a whisper of suspicion, now struck Farid like a blow, forcing him to confront what he had been trying so desperately to ignore. Farid could no longer deny the doubt clawing at him. He began to monitor Safia's movements closely, all while feigning ignorance, watching as she became more guarded, more secretive. His heart grew heavy with each passing day, the weight of betrayal pressing down on him like a stone. He knew he could no longer avoid the truth, but still, he chose silence, waiting for the right moment, the irrefutable proof he needed. As he watched Safia retreat further into her secrets, he felt his patience slipping, his composure eroding under the strain. The love he had once held for her began to sour, turning into bitterness and suspicion. He knew their marriage was unraveling, that the emotional connection he had cherished was slipping through his fingers. The only thing left was the waiting, the calm before the storm he could feel brewing, a storm that would soon rip their lives apart in ways they could never imagine. By early 2012, the tension in Farid's household had reached a breaking point. Safia, consumed by guilt yet unable to sever her attachment to Adil, found herself spiraling deeper into a web of deceit and longing. Each interaction with Adil felt like walking a tightrope, a precarious balancing act between desire and the fear of discovery. Little did she know, the quiet storm brewing in Farid had transformed into something dark and vengeful, waiting for the right moment to explode. Farid's patience had finally run out. The rumors, the hidden glances, the late-night phone calls that fell silent when he entered the room, all of it was more than he could bear. In his mind, betrayal lurked in every corner, twisting his love into bitterness. He could no longer ignore the instincts that told him something was terribly wrong. Determined to uncover the truth, he began to follow Safia more closely, watching her every move, every subtle shift in her behavior. The final blow came one evening in February, when Farid returned home unexpectedly. He had been on a short business trip but felt an overwhelming urge to come back early, driven by an instinct he couldn't explain. As he entered the house, the quietness inside seemed almost ominous. The children were staying with his sister Alia for the night, leaving the home eerily still. As he set his briefcase down, he heard hushed voices coming from the guest room, a room typically reserved for Adil during his visits. A chill ran down his spine as he approached the door, listening closely. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat thudding with a mix of anger, dread, and anticipation. He could hear Safia's soft voice, followed by Adil's, their tones low and intimate. Without a second thought, Farid pushed the door open, his worst suspicions laid bare before him. The sight of his wife, Safia, and his father, Adil, entwined in an intimate embrace shattered whatever restraint he had left. For a brief, frozen moment, none of them moved. Safiya's face turned pale, her eyes wide with shock and fear. Adil, usually composed and authoritative, looked equally stunned, his grip on Safiya's hand slipping as he tried to pull away. But it was too late. The truth had been exposed, and the betrayal that had simmered beneath the surface was now undeniable. Farid's voice, once calm and measured, erupted in a storm of fury. Words of betrayal, humiliation, and heartbreak spilled from his lips as he confronted them, his rage so palpable it filled the room like a suffocating heat. Safiya stammered, attempting to explain, but her words were drowned by the fury in Farid's voice. Adil tried to speak, to defuse the situation, but the rage burning in Farid's eyes left no room for forgiveness. In a blind fury, Farid grabbed the closest object within reach, a decorative knife that had hung on the wall as a family heirloom, a symbol of their heritage now turned into a weapon of destruction. Without a second thought, he lunged at Adil, years of bottled-up anger and betrayal fueling each thrust. The knife found its mark, plunging into Adil repeatedly, each strike driven by the pain that had festered inside him for months. Safiya's scream pierced the air, but Farid was deaf to it, his mind consumed by the weight of his actions. Blood pooled beneath Adil's body as he crumpled to the floor, the strength and authority that had once defined him now stripped away in a brutal act of violence. The room, once a place of family gatherings, had become the scene of an unthinkable crime, a twisted reflection of the family's shattered bonds. As the reality of what he had done settled over him, Farid's fury began to wane, replaced by a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. He turned to Safiya, his gaze filled with a mix of anger and heartbreak, yet before he could speak, his own body betrayed him. Overwhelmed by the magnitude of his actions, Farid collapsed to the floor, the knife slipping from his grasp and clattering onto the blood-stained ground beside him. The aftermath was a blur. A neighbor, having heard the commotion and Safiya's scream, called the police, unaware of the tragedy unfolding inside. The flashing lights soon cast an eerie glow over the quiet street as officers entered the home cautiously, taking in the scene of devastation before them. Farid, covered in his father's blood, sat motionless on the floor, his expression vacant and haunted. Adil's lifeless body lay beside him, while Safiya, still in shock, sat frozen in the corner, her face a mask of terror and disbelief. The weight of Farid's actions, of the betrayal and the irrevocable choices made in a single, violent moment, settled heavily over the house. What had once been a sanctuary, a place of family and tradition, was now the scene of an unspeakable tragedy. Farid was taken into custody, his life forever altered, leaving behind the broken pieces of a family that would never be whole again. In the days following the tragedy, the news of Adil's murder spread like wildfire throughout the community. Farid, once a respected businessman and family man, was now the subject of scandal and whispers. Neighbors who once admired him as a devoted husband and successful professional now looked on in shock, their voices low and guarded as they exchanged stories of the unimaginable events that had taken place in his home. The betrayal, the violence, the sheer horror of a son killing his own father, it was a scandal that tore through the community, leaving an indelible stain on the family's reputation. Safiya, meanwhile, was left to face the consequences of her actions. Though she wasn't charged with the murder itself, her role in the affair was no secret. The police investigation brought every sordid detail to light, painting a picture of deceit and desire that had simmered beneath the surface of her marriage for years. As the story unfolded, Safiya's image as a dutiful wife and mother was shattered. She became a figure of disdain, a woman who had brought shame upon her family and community. The trial was swift yet deeply painful, a public reckoning that forced each family member to relive the events that had led to this moment. Farid, sitting in the defendant's seat, bore a gaunt expression as he listened to the details of his own crime recounted with clinical precision. The courtroom was packed with onlookers, all eager to witness the dramatic unraveling of a family they had once admired. The prosecution painted Farid as a man driven to the edge by betrayal, his act of violence a tragic culmination of unchecked rage and heartbreak. Farid's defense, however, leaned on his emotional turmoil, arguing that his crime was not premeditated but a reaction to an unbearable provocation. Under Sharia law, the court took into account the emotional torment he had endured, showing a rare leniency. Yet, the gravity of the crime could not be dismissed, and the court sentenced Farid to 15 years in prison, a punishment that acknowledged both the severity of his actions and the pain that had driven him to such extremes. Safiya's punishment, however, was less about the law and more about social condemnation. While she avoided a formal sentence, the judgment of the community was as severe as any legal penalty. Friends, neighbors, and even distant relatives turned their backs on her, seeing her as the root cause of the tragedy. She became an outcast, her once respected role reduced to that of a pariah, a symbol of betrayal and ruin. Every glance, every whispered conversation was a reminder of the shame she had brought upon herself and her children. The community that had once celebrated the family's achievements now saw them as a cautionary tale. Women whispered to one another, speaking of Safiya as an example of temptation leading to ruin, a warning to guard their marriages and honor. Men, who had once respected Adil's influence, now viewed his actions with contempt, the man who had betrayed both his son and his own family's values. Even in death, Adil's reputation was tarnished, the authority he had wielded lost in the shadow of his indiscretions. As Farid began his prison sentence, he grappled with the consequences of his own rage. Alone in his cell, the weight of his actions bore down on him, filling his mind with bitter regret and anger. The love he once held for Safiya had transformed into a deep, festering bitterness, tempered by the knowledge that he would carry the memory of that night with him for the rest of his life. The violence, the betrayal, the destruction of his family, all of it replayed endlessly in his mind, a haunting reminder of the life he had lost in a single, irrevocable act. Safiya, now isolated from both her family and her community, was left to piece together the fragments of her shattered life. The children, confused and heartbroken, were taken in by relatives, the only source of stability left in the wake of their parents' actions. Safiya's attempts to reach out, to reconnect with her children, were met with silence. The family had decided it was best if she remained distant, preserving what was left of the children's innocence and shielding them from the scandal that had engulfed their lives. In the quiet of her solitude, Safiya was left with only her memories and her guilt. She spent countless nights revisiting every decision, every stolen glance, every word shared in secrecy with Adil, haunted by the choices that had torn her family apart. Her once beloved role as wife and mother had been reduced to ashes, her reputation forever tainted. The burden of her actions weighed heavily on her, the knowledge that her decisions had led not only to Adil's death but to the complete devastation of everyone she held dear. The community's condemnation was unrelenting, and over time, Safiya accepted her role as the catalyst for the family's ruin. Her days were marked by isolation, her future bleak. She had lost everything, her husband, her father-in-law, her children, and any semblance of respectability she once held. In the end, the affair had not only taken the lives of those she loved but had irrevocably scarred her own, leaving her to endure the consequences alone. This tragic tale of betrayal, desire, and unchecked rage became a cautionary legend, spoken of in hushed tones and shared among families as a warning. Safiya and Farid, once bound by tradition, had destroyed each other in the pursuit of something they could never truly have, leaving behind a broken legacy and a haunting reminder of the destructive power of betrayal. By the end of 2015, the once proud family had been left in ruin, a broken and fractured shadow of its former self. Safiya, alone and shunned, was burdened by the weight of her choices. She had no one left to turn to, no home to return to, and no role within the community that had once accepted her. She spent her days in solitude, her mind plagued by memories of the life she had destroyed. With Farid in prison, the children in the care of distant relatives, and Adil's death forever staining the family's legacy, Safiya was a woman marked by shame and regret, living a life haunted by the sins of her past. While Safiya faced the harsh judgment of society, Farid endured his own reckoning within the confines of his prison cell. Every day he woke to the same cold walls, a constant reminder of the violence he had unleashed in a moment of rage. Though he had been granted a degree of leniency by the court, the weight of his actions gnawed at him, relentless in its intensity. The love he once had for Safia had curdled into something darker, a hollow bitterness that gnawed away at him as he relived the events of that fateful night over and over again. Yet, with time, Farid's anger began to fade, replaced by a deep, unyielding sorrow. He would spend hours in his cell, reflecting on the choices that had led him down this path, wondering if things could have been different. In the quiet of his confinement, Farid came to understand that the hatred he felt towards Safia and Adil had consumed him, and that in his quest for revenge, he had lost himself. He had become a man he no longer recognized, a prisoner of his own emotions long before he became a prisoner of the state. Farid's children, the innocent casualties of their parents' actions, grew up away from the chaos that had once defined their family. Shielded by their caretakers from the details of their parents' betrayal, they were raised in relative quiet, though the whispers of scandal lingered. They carried a different surname, a subtle attempt to protect them from the weight of their family's disgrace. Yet, as they grew older, the children would inevitably learn the truth, and with that knowledge came the burden of a legacy they could not escape, a legacy defined by betrayal, violence, and a tragedy that had shattered the lives of everyone involved. Safia, trapped in her isolation, clung to faint hopes of reconnecting with her children. She sent letters to their caretakers, trying to explain herself, to offer some semblance of remorse and apology. But the letters went unanswered, her words reaching no one but the blank pages on which they were written. Her children, the one thread of hope she had left, were as distant as her former life, lost to her forever. And as each letter was ignored, her isolation deepened, leaving her with only her guilt and regret to keep her company. In the end, the family's downfall became a lesson whispered among the members of the community, a reminder of the consequences of unchecked desires and hidden betrayals. Mothers spoke of Safia's fate to warn their daughters, cautioning them against temptation and the danger of straying from their roles. Fathers recalled Adil's mistakes, urging their sons to prioritize honor and tradition over fleeting passions. The story of Safia and Farid's family became a symbol, a tale of what could happen when love turned sour and secrets became deadly. The community, once united in respect for the family's achievements, now viewed them with a mixture of pity and scorn. Those who had once been close friends kept their distance, unwilling to associate with the remnants of a family marked by scandal. And over time, even the memory of their once honorable lives faded, replaced by a story of shame and regret that would haunt the community for generations. In prison, Farid continued to serve his sentence, his days blending together in a gray monotony. He was a man forever changed by his actions, bound not only by the prison walls but by the remorse that haunted him. He had sought to exact punishment for the betrayal he had suffered, yet in doing so, he had destroyed himself as much as he had destroyed the lives of others. There was no redemption for him, only the slow, steady passing of time and the quiet acceptance of his own ruin. As for Safia, she remained a ghost in the community, her life marked by isolation and reflection. She carried with her the guilt of a mother who had lost her children, a wife who had betrayed her husband, and a woman whose desires had led to the devastation of everything she had once held dear. Each day she lived was a reminder of her transgressions, a penance served in silence and solitude. She was, in a sense, as much a prisoner as Farid, though her bars were invisible and her confinement self-imposed. And so, the tragic legacy of Safia and Farid's family lived on, a cautionary tale etched into the hearts of those who had witnessed their downfall. What had once been a family built on respect and tradition had crumbled under the weight of secrets and betrayal, leaving behind only memories of what could have been. The lives of those who remained were forever shaped by the tragedy, a reminder that love, once tainted by deceit, could bring nothing but ruin. In the quiet of their separate existences, both Safia and Farid were left to face the consequences of their choices. Their family, once a beacon of honor, had been reduced to whispers and shadows. And as they spent their remaining days consumed by regret and reflection, the story of their fall served as a warning to all who heard it, a reminder of the destructive power of betrayal, the ruinous path of unchecked desire, and the irreversible consequences of a moment's fury.